Okay, so in this lecture we talked about introductory topics in A and P, and then we covered cells and also skin. So anatomy, of course, is the study of body structure, and physiology is the study of body function. And the anatomy, the way we are set up, is what allows the physiology to happen. It allows the way that the body functions. Now, when we talk about the basic organization of the human body, we have small components that build upon each other to make the entire organism. And there are 6 main levels of organization. From smallest to biggest, we have the chemical level, the cellular level, tissue level, organ system, and then the organismal level, which is the entire organism. So we'll just talk about each of those really quickly. So the chemical level, this is the smallest and the least complex of the levels. And this is where we find atoms and molecules. So sometimes you might see the chemical level called the molecular level. So these molecules combine to form cells. So this is our next level. And cells are the basic structural and functional units of organisms. Now, when cells come together to perform a specific task or a common function, they are called a tissue. And tissues also have extracellular matrix, so there is stuff between these cells that are coming together. And there are 4 basic tissue types. There's connective, muscle, epithelial, and nervous tissue, which we will talk about in a little bit. So when you have 2 or more different tissues come together to form a structure with a specific shape, we call that an organ. And when you have different organs come together to perform a common task or a common function, it's called an organ system, and there are 11 organ systems. So again, just to review this, small things build up to make bigger things until we get the entire organism. So from the chemical level, we go to the cellular level, then the tissue level, organ system level, and then the entire organism. So living organisms, life, have specific processes that kind of make them living. And these include metabolism, responsiveness, movement, growth, differentiation, and reproduction. Metabolism, this is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. This includes anabolism, which is building up, so making things, taking small things and building them up to make bigger things. And also catabolism, which is breaking down. So for example, the food that you eat, you break it down into smaller components so you can use them for energy. Responsiveness is the ability for you to respond to your environment, whether that could be your external or internal environment. Movement, the ability to move, not just move your entire body, but for certain organs in your body to move, like your heart and your digestive tract. Growth, so growth of cells, growth of the entire organism. Differentiation, so the ability for cells to mature and kind of become a new cell. So we talked about this in micro with B cells. They differentiate into plasma cells. We all start with stem cells, and all these stem cells differentiate into specific lines of cells that will go on to do various things. That's why we have all this variation in our body. But we all started from simple cells that were pretty much the same. And also reproduction. Not just reproduction of an entire organism, which is important, but also reproduction of cells, cell division. So homeostasis, this is the body's attempt at balance. So the balance or stabilization of the body's internal environment despite changes in the internal and the external environment. Okay? Homeo means sameness, stasis means standing still. Our bodies are in a constant state of flux. It's never completely even for any particular function. For example, temperature changes all the time. Our body temperature. Blood pressure changes minute to minute. So it's never, always the same. There's always changes, but our bodies attempt to keep that stable. That's homeostasis. And homeostasis is controlled by feedback systems. And there are 2 types of feedback. There's negative feedback, positive feedback. Negative feedback, by far the most common type of feedback mechanism in the body. This is how we control most of our functions. And this is when we reverse a change in a controlled condition. So it's like a seesaw. If something goes up, your body works to bring it back down. If something goes down, your body works to bring it back up. So for example, blood pressure. If blood pressure goes up, we have mechanisms to bring that back down. Blood pressure goes down, we have mechanisms to bring that back up. Same thing with blood glucose. If blood glucose goes up, produce more insulin. And of course, body temperature. If you're cold, you shiver. If you're hot, you sweat. So that's negative feedback. Positive feedback, this is when a change is reinforced. Okay, so a change in a control condition is reinforced. Not common at all. The best examples are childbirth. So the oxytocin stimulates contractions of the uterus, and those contractions feed back to cause the production of more oxytocin, which causes stronger contractions. And also any cascade events in the body, like blood clotting or the complement system when we talk about it in the immune system, those are examples of positive feedback. It's like a domino effect. So directional terms, these are important because I will use them a lot when describing different things. So anterior means towards the front of the body. Posterior means towards the back of the body. Superior means towards the head. Inferior means towards the tail. Medial means toward the midline of the body. Lateral means away from the midline of the body. Proximal and distal, this is in reference to the extremities, to the limbs. Proximal means closer to a point of attachment. So if we're talking about the upper extremity, that's going to be the shoulder. So for example, the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. And vice versa, the elbow is distal to the shoulder, or the fingers are distal to the elbow when in anatomical position. Superficial means closer to the skin, from coming in the inside. And then deep is away from the skin, deeper to the inside of the body. Planes and sections, these are also important because we will look at a lot of pictures of things in certain planes, so I'd like you to understand what these planes are. These are just ways to divide the body. So a sagittal plane is going to divide the body into left and right parts. And we can have mid-sagittal planes when the body is divided evenly. That's called a cardinal plane. Or parasagittal, which is just any plane outside of the mid-sagittal plane that divides the body into left and right parts. Now, the transverse plane is going to divide the body into superior and inferior parts. The frontal or the coronal plane is going to divide the body into anterior and posterior parts. And oblique planes are basically any plane that's between any two other planes. So body cavities, these are just spaces in the body where organs are found. The cranial cavity, this includes the brain and the vertebral canal where the spinal cord sits. And then the thoracic cavity is the chest cavity, but the thoracic cavity itself has 3 cavities within it. It has 2 pleural cavities, 1 for each lung, as well as a pericardial cavity, which is where the heart lives. Now, the mediastinum, this is just a region in the central portion of the thoracic cavity. It's not a cavity, it's just a region. And we find stuff like the heart and the great vessels of the heart and the esophagus and the trachea, things like that in the mediastinum. The abdominal pelvic cavity, which is separated from the thoracic cavity by the diaphragm, has the organs of the abdomen and the pelvis. I don't consider them separate cavities because there's nothing physically separating them, so I just tend to call it the abdominal pelvic cavity. So abdominal pelvic quadrants and regions. These are also important when we talk about especially abdominal diseases and different types of pain. The quadrants, there are 4 quadrants. There's the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. And we can kind of further divide these into smaller regions to be more specific. So these are abdominal pelvic regions. And again, this just applies to the abdominal pelvic cavity. Nothing in the thoracic cavity, everything below the diaphragm. So on the sides, we have hypochondriac regions, lumbar regions, and iliac. This is sometimes also known as inguinal regions. So we have that on the right and the left. And in the middle, we have epigastric, which is above the stomach, but also includes the stomach. Epi means upon. And this is going to be really important when we talk about things like pancreatitis. The umbilical region, which is right in the middle, it's where the umbilicus is. And then the hypogastric region, which is down here. And then we started to talk about the cells. So again, cells are the basic structural and functional unit of the body. Cells, it's what makes us up. Cells are the structures that do our work. Cytology is the study of cells, cell physiology, the study of the function of cells, and the three main parts are the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. So let's talk about the plasma membrane. So it's a flexible barrier that consists mostly of phospholipids and proteins. Most of these proteins are glycoproteins. So it's a phospholipid bilayer, which means there are kind of two layers. We call them leaflets. And there's also cholesterol and glycolipids and glycoproteins kind of dispersed throughout the membrane. Now, these glycoproteins in the membrane can be integral proteins where they go all the way through like this. This is an integral protein. This is also an integral protein. Or peripheral proteins where they kind of only sit in one of these leaflets. Now, it's a phospholipid bilayer, but these portions up here, these are called the phosphate heads, and they are hydrophilic. And they face water on both sides, so inside the cell and outside the cell. These tails, these lipid tails, they're hydrophobic, so they face each other. They're afraid of water. So that's how you get this sort of shape. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable, which means it lets some stuff through, but not other things. Now, those integral proteins, they have a number of functions. I don't really care so much that you know these different functions. We'll talk about them as we go. In peripheral proteins, they're typically enzymes, or they can be linker proteins, but that's really not that important. I just care mostly that you know the difference between integral proteins and peripheral proteins. So again, here's just a larger view of the plasma membrane. You can see these two leaflets here. Again, these are hydrophilic heads up here, and these are the hydrophobic tails. And these are some of these proteins. So here's an integral protein. This one happens to be a channel. This one's also this could have a number of functions here, but this is an integral protein. This is an integral protein. This is a peripheral protein. So lots of stuff. All these little things in here. This is cholesterol. And the components are gonna vary from cell type to cell type. So certain cells have, more cholesterol. Other cells have less cholesterol. Some are gonna have more channel proteins. It depends on the cell type. Okay, now let's talk about transport across the membrane. So there are two compartments. There's the intracellular compartment and the extracellular compartment. Intracellular compartment is inside the cells, and extracellular is everything outside the cells. And we have fluid in both of these areas. Now the intracellular fluid, the fluid inside cells, is where we find the majority of our body's fluid, body's water, about 67%. This is also the cytosol within the cell. The extracellular fluid, this is the fluid outside the body's cells, and takes up about 33% of the body water. Interstitial fluid, this is a type of extracellular fluid that's found between the cells, okay, in the spaces between the cells. So the ECF in blood is basically serum. The ECF in lymphatic vessels is lymph, and the ECF in the central nervous system is cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so concentration. Concentration is how much solute you have in a solution. Remember that a solution is a solute plus a solvent. The solute dissolves in the solvent. Okay? The amount of the solute in this solvent or in the solution is the concentration. A concentration gradient is the difference in concentration between two different locations. Most importantly, the intracellular compartment and the extracellular compartment. Now, when I say that something's moving down a concentration gradient, that means things are moving from high concentration to low concentration. So if you have, a bunch of stuff here, they're going to move this way to low concentration. That does not take energy. We'll talk about that in a second. When I say that things are moving up a concentration gradient, so from here to here, okay, that means they are going from an area of low concentration to high concentration. That takes energy, which makes sense. So movement can either be passive or active. Passive means that things are moving down the concentration gradient. No energy is required. Active processes require energy, cellular energy, to push things up a concentration gradient. The passive processes we're going to talk about are simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. Anytime you see the word diffusion, it's passive. No energy required. And then the active processes, we're just going to talk about active transport. Vesicular transport is just the movement of vesicles throughout the cell. So in simple diffusion is when things just move right across the lipid bilayer. Okay? So if I draw the lipid bilayer really quickly here. Things just move right through with no problems. And that's because they're lipid soluble. Remember, the bilayer is a lipid. So this is just when things move right through without any issues. And these are things like oxygen, CO2, water, of course, the fat-soluble vitamins, steroids. Steroids are lipids. Small alcohols, waste products like urea and ammonia, they can just simply diffuse. And again, no energy required. Now with facilitated diffusion, it's still passive. Things are still moving down a concentration gradient, but they need a helper, like a channel protein. Okay. Because maybe they're too big, or maybe they are hydrophilic. They can't move right through the membrane. So they need the help of a integral protein. And a lot of these are ion channels, like potassium channels and chloride channels, very abundant, but also sodium, calcium, and some others. Glucose also passes by facilitated diffusion in some cases. So that's the big takeaway. Again, none of these require any energy. Now, osmosis is similar, but this is the movement of water through a selectively permeable membrane. And in the body, they can move right through the membrane, or they can move through water channels called porins. And then we talked about tonicity, which is the relative concentration of solutions that determines the direction and extent of diffusion. Basically, if you have more stuff in one of the compartments, intracellular or extracellular, water is going to move to dilute that, to try to even out the concentration. So I'm just going to go right to this slide and start with isotonic solution. So in an isotonic solution, the concentration of stuff is the same inside the cell and outside the cell. So if we have, 3 things here, we have 3 things here. That means water is going to have basically no net movement. The same amount of water is coming in as going out. And that's how our body exists normally. In a hypertonic solution, we have a lot more stuff out here than in here. So water leaves the cell and it shrinks. In a hypotonic solution, we have more stuff in here and less stuff out here. So water is going to move in, and the cell is going to swell up and possibly rupture. So active transport, again, active means energy is required. And this is because we are pushing things against a concentration gradient. I use the example in class. Imagine 50 people packed into the front of the classroom, and you trying to push somebody through them. That takes a lot of energy. And this occurs at pumps, which are carrier proteins, and they are going to transport ions. The most famous one being the sodium-potassium pump, which we'll talk about in a lot of detail later in the course. And this pump is going to keep sodium concentration high on the outside of the cell and low on the inside, and keep potassium concentration high on the inside and low on the outside. And it takes energy to do that because the sodium-potassium pump is pushing these ions against their concentration gradient. So here's just the sodium-potassium pump. So 3 sodiums pumped out, 2 potassiums pumped in. It takes energy to do that. And the energy currency of our cells, of course, is ATP. Okay, so structure of the cell. We're going to talk about the cytoplasm. So we talked about the membrane, now we're talking about the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is just everything that's between the cell membrane or the plasma membrane and the membrane of the nucleus. So all this crap in here. This includes cytosol, which is just the water and dissolved solutes, the cytoskeleton, which we'll talk about, and the organelles. So cytosol, this is the liquid portion of the cytoplasm, mostly water. This is the intracellular fluid, but there's also dissolved solutes within the water. And a number of chemical reactions are going to occur here. The cytoskeleton, the inside of the cell is packed with stuff. There's very little open space. And a lot of it's taken up by the cytoskeleton, which are these protein filaments that will have a number of functions. Microfilaments are the smallest, and they provide a lot of mechanical support, especially in structures like microvilli, and they are important. They're motor proteins, so they're important in generating movements within the cell. And they're made up of a protein called actin. Intermediate filaments, the big thing that you should take away here is that they resist tension within the cell. Really important, they resist tension. They also hold organelles in place, but really all of these do that. And then microtubules, these are the largest. These are important for cell shape, and they also are like the monorail system of the cell. They're going to move vesicles and organelles throughout the cell. So the organelles, these are the little organs that are kind of, they're if you think of the cell as a body, the organelles are the organs that help that cell function. So these are the important ones. So the lysosome is like the garbage container. It's like a bag of hydrolytic enzymes that are going to break things down, like pathogens and cellular debris. Mitochondria, of course, these are the structures that make energy. The vast majority of energy is made in the mitochondria. The nucleus, so the nucleus, of course, this is kind of the brains. This is where we have our DNA. This is where transcription occurs. The nucleolus, this is a little sub-portion within the nucleus. It's like a dark portion of the nucleus, and this is where we're going to assemble ribosomes. And of course, ribosomes are going to make proteins. This is where translation is going to happen. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum, we have smooth types and rough types. The rough type is studded with ribosomes, and they are going to make proteins. The rough endoplasmic reticulum is going to make proteins that will be shipped out of the cell. Okay, they have destination outside the cell. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is going to function in making lipids and detoxing certain things within the cell. Now, a lot of these products from the endoplasmic reticulum will travel to the Golgi, and the Golgi is kind of like the UPS center. It receives these packages from the endoplasmic reticulum, these products. It's going to place stickers on them, maybe tape up the boxes, and then it's going to ship them out. This is kind of like the final shipping, the shipping yard for the cell. The centrioles are going to make what's known as the spindle apparatus during cell division, and this is what helps to separate the chromosomes. And I think, those are all the ones that you should be familiar with for the exam. Okay, then we talked about tissues. Histology is the science that studies tissues. There are obviously many cell types, but only 4 basic tissue types. There's connective tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and nervous tissue. Connective tissues, these are protective and supportive tissues. They also store energy for us. They transport things throughout the body in the case of blood and lymph. Muscle, its main job is to generate force, which is needed for movement. Not only movement of our body, but also, again, movement of organs within our body, like the GI tract and the heart. Epithelial tissue covers and lines portions of the body, as well as forms portions of glands and the ducts of those glands. And the nervous tissue, this is going to detect changes and initiate nerve impulses and all of that. So we're going to talk about each one. So epithelial tissue, or epithelium, can either be covering and lining epithelium, which is going to cover and line stuff, or glandular epithelium, which is going to make up portions of glands. So the glandular epithelium, again, forms the secreting portion of glands. Epithelial cells, they are closely packed, so they are there's not much space between them, so very little interstitial fluid in epithelial tissue. It is avascular, but it does have a nerve supply. Avascular, but it'll get oxygen through diffusion of underlying connective tissue. Epithelial cells, they tend to divide and have a rapid rate of turnover. And the implication of disease is that if cells are dividing a lot, there's greater chance for something to go wrong. And when things go wrong with cell division, that's what forms the basis of cancer. So let's talk about covering and lining epithelium and how we classify it. So we classify it by the shape of the cells and the arrangement of those cells in relation to each other. So I'm just going to go right to this slide because it's the best one. So if we talk about the shape of the cells, we have three main shapes. We have squamous, which these are really flat cells. We have cuboidal, which are cube-shaped cells. And we have columnar, which are these column-shaped cells. And if they are arranged in a simple arrangement, it's just one cell layer, If they're in a stratified arrangement, there are multiple layers, okay? More than one layer. So we can have stratified squamous, which is really common. Stratified cuboidal you find in glands and certain ducts. Stratified columnar, I honestly couldn't give you an example in the body where this is present. If it's anywhere, it's quite rare. And then we have this special type called pseudostratified, which is found in areas of the respiratory tract. And it looks like it's stratified, but it's really not. It's not, because all of these cells will contact this base layer down here. So that's how we classify epithelial tissue. Now, I talked about these special types of simple squamous epithelium, and you should definitely know these. Endothelium, this is simple squamous epithelium that lines the inside of blood vessels, lymph vessels, and the heart. And this type of epithelium is going to be really, really important. You're going to hear me say it a lot because it's important in cardiovascular patho. Mesothelium, these are secreting cells, and they form the epithelial layer of serous membranes. And serous membranes are these membranes that line cavities and the organs within those cavities. So we have pleura. Pleura lines the lungs, which is called visceral pleura, as well as the pleural cavities. We have peritoneum, which lines the digestive organs, visceral peritoneum, and the abdominal cavity, which is the parietal peritoneum, and the pericardium, which of course is the mesothelium of the heart. So glandular epithelium, there are two subtypes. There's exocrine glandular epithelium and endocrine glandular epithelium. Exocrine glandular epithelium, these are exocrine glands. The products of these glands are going to reach the surface of some layer of epithelium. Okay, so they reach an epithelial surface by ducts. This is different than endocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the body, within the body. That's why it's called endocrine. So they go right into the blood. So that's the big difference. Exocrine, basically, exocrine glandular epithelium is going to pretty much produce its products that will reach the outside of the body, endo, within the body, into the blood. Then we talked about connective tissue, which is definitely the most abundant tissue in the body. Lots and lots of functions. So it transports things, and of course it connects things, it binds, supports, insulates, stores energy, has cells and more extracellular matrix than epithelial tissue. So there are mature and embryonic types, but we're just going to talk about mature types of connective tissue, starting with loose and dense connective tissue. So loose connective tissue, quite a few cells, but not many fibers, so it looks loose when you look at it under the microscope. We have areolar types, which is just all over the place. We have basal lamina. Basal lamina is found underscoring epithelium. So those epithelial cells actually make this basal lamina. Okay, they kind of make their seat that they sit on. So the basal lamina helps to anchor the epithelium. Lamina propria, this is found under mucosal tissue, and then this reticular tissue is found in some of the lymphoid organs. Dense connective tissue, lots and lots of fibers, fewer cells. We have dense regular types, which are found in tendons and ligaments. Dense irregular, which we see in areas like the dermis of the skin, and elastic connective tissue, which is pretty abundant throughout the body. So this is areolar connective tissue, this is dense irregular connective tissue, this is dense regular connective tissue, and this is elastic connective tissue. So cartilage is another type of mature connective tissue. It's a very strong tissue, it's flexible, has lots of collagen, has those GAGs like glycosaminoglycans and glycoproteins, which are pretty, these like collagen and GAGs and glycoproteins, these are consistent for most of these connective tissue types. It's just kind of their relative amount that differs. And we have three types of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage, by far the most abundant. You find this on the articular surface of long bones. You find it on the ventral surface of the ribs 1 through 10 on each side. The trachea, the rings of the trachea, bronchi, and portions of the larynx. Elastic cartilage, really it looks the same as hyaline cartilage, which is here. There's just more elasticity. There's more elastic fibers. And we find it in portions of the epiglottis, which is structure of the larynx, and also in the ear. Fibrocartilage, it's kind of a hybrid tissue. It's part dense regular connective tissue and hyaline cartilage. And we find it between the bodies of the vertebrae. Those are the intervertebral discs. We find it at the pubic symphysis, which is where the pelvic bones meet on the anterior surface. And we find it at the temporomandibular joint. Bone tissue, lots of collagen. Again, we call the matrix of bone, before it's calcified, we call it osteoid. Again, GAGs and glycoproteins, and then these will become calcified. And of course, the job of bone is to support our body, to protect in certain cases, like the cranium and the thoracic cage, and also contributes to mineral balance and storage of bone marrow and things like that. Three main cell types here are osteocytes, which are these guys here. Osteocytes are just the cells that kind of maintain bone. They're the typical bone cell. Osteoblasts, which will actually become osteocytes once they kind of lock themselves in. Osteoblasts build up the bone, they make bone, and then osteoclasts will break down bone. Adipose tissue, lots and lots of cells called adipocytes, few fibers. Nice, rich blood supply, which you can see here. This is portions of the blood supply. And there are brown and white types. Adults mostly have white types of fat. And again, this is where we store energy. And it helps insulate and protect organs and things like that. So these are the cells. These are actually the nuclei here. You can see that they're just packed with triglycerides. So blood, we'll talk about blood in a lot more detail later, but blood has the plasma component and then the formed elements, the cellular components, so red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Serum, this is plasma minus clotting factors. And then lymph is the filtrate of blood and tissues. We'll talk about how lymph forms later in the course, but it's basically serum. Here's a blood smear. These are white blood cells, neutrophils. This one looks like a lymphocyte. These are red blood cells, all these guys, and then the little specks are the platelets or thrombocytes. Membranes, these are just flat sheets of pliable tissue that cover a lined part of the body, and they're pretty much made up of epithelial tissue plus some connective tissue. We have mucous membranes or mucosa. These are going to line areas of the body that contact the external environment, like the urinary tract, the respiratory tract, the GI tract. Serous membranes, or serosa, we talked about those earlier with mesothelium. These are going to line organs, the outside of organs, and the cavities that they are found in, as well as synovial membranes, which we find at synovial joints. And they're going to be important for giving the joint structure, as well as for the production of synovial fluid to help lubricate and resist shock. Muscle tissue, primarily it's going to produce movement, but also, of course, maintains our posture. Stores glycogen. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose, and it also generates heat. And there are three main types. There's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So let's talk about each of those. So skeletal muscle tissue, this is voluntary, which means you can control it. It's striated, and it's attached to bones by tendons. In some cases, they attach to skin. For example, some of the facial muscles attach to skin. Almost all the facial muscles attach to skin. And again, these are voluntary. Cardiac muscle tissue is also striated, but it's involuntary, and this is found in the middle layer of the heart called the myocardium. And what makes this tissue unique is when you look at it, you have these what are known as intercalated discs, and these allow fast communications of impulses through these cells. Smooth muscle tissue, you're going to find this in the walls of hollow organs. So, for example, the organs of the GI tract, the blood vessels, some of the airways, and this is involuntary and non-striated. And then finally, nervous tissue. So we can roughly divide this into two types of cells. We have neurons, which is your basic nerve cell. These are the cells that are going to conduct impulses. And then the neuroglia means nerve glue, and they are supportive cells of the nervous system. And there's a number of them that we'll talk about when we get to the nervous system. And unfortunately, there's poor capacity for regeneration. And then we finished talking about the skin, or the integumentary system, which includes the skin, the hair, and the nails, and the accessory glands like sebaceous glands and sweat glands. The skin has two layers. There's epidermis and dermis. Okay? The epidermis is epithelium, and the dermis is connective tissue. Okay? It's dense, irregular connective tissue. The integumentary system has a number of functions, of course, protection, vitamin D synthesis, thermoregulation, absorption, a little bit of excretion. The hypodermis, or the subcu, or the subcutaneous layer, is just fat, and it's not a part of the skin. It's not a part of the integumentary system. So the epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium, and it has 4 layers in most places, 5 layers on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And there are 4 principal cell types, which we'll talk about here. So keratinocytes, these are your basic cells of the epidermis. And they contain, well, they'll make keratin, and then they will contain keratin. Basically, the top layer of the skin is just dead cells that are bags of keratin. Now, melanocytes, these are epidermal cells that are found in the basal layers, and they produce melanin, which is important for resisting UV radiation and contributes to our skin color and hair color. Langerhans cells, these are basically dendritic cells. They're antigen-presenting cells, so important in the immune system. And then Merkel cells, nobody really has an idea what they do, but they are in contact with these structures known as Merkel's discs, which are actually receptors for sustained pressure. Now, like I said, most areas of the skin have 4 layers of epidermis. We call this thin skin. And then thick skin is the areas where there are 5 layers. And the layers of the epidermis from deep to superficial are the stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and the stratum corneum. Now that's where it is in thin skin, so most of the body. But the stratum lucidum, this is kind of sandwiched in between granulosum and corneum in thick skin. So that's the 5th layer. Now, these basal cells, basically the epidermis starts at the base, and it kind of just, these spinosum cells were once basal cells. These granulosum cells were once spinosum cells. So they just kind of push up and out. Okay, so these cells that are in this layer will eventually make their way into this layer, and this layer, and this layer. So the dermis, this is the deeper of the 2 layers, and it itself has 2 layers. It has a papillary layer and a reticular layer. The papillary layer is going to basically supply the epidermis and anchor the epidermis. It's going to supply the epidermis with blood and also anchor it. It's the thinner of the 2 layers, and a lot more cells, especially immune cells like lymphocytes and some dendritic cells and macrophages and things like that. Also fibroblasts, which will be important for making fibers, which is important for connective tissue. And then the reticular layer, this is the deeper of the 2 layers. It's the most fibrous layer, lots of fibers. It's connected to the subcutaneous layer, which is not a part of the skin. And like I said earlier, dense irregular connective tissue. Lots of collagen and elastin. Here's just the schematic of the skin. So all of this up here, this is all epidermis. Up here is going to be the papillary layer. Lots of cells, blood vessels. Down here is the reticular layer, lots and lots of fibers. It's also where we will find some of these accessory structures, which we're going to talk about. So the hair, nails, and glands, obviously the hair, the nails, which we're not going to talk about in any detail, and then the glands we'll talk about in a second. Also have these smooth muscles known as erector pili muscles, and what they do is they cause the hairs to stand up on their ends, cause goosebumps. So as far as the glands, there are a few. We have sebaceous glands and sudoriferous glands. Sebaceous glands produce sebum or oil, and sudoriferous glands produce sweat. Now in the ear, we have ceruminous glands, and they produce cerumen, which is earwax, and they are really just modified sweat glands. So the functions of the skin, thermoregulation, of course. So This is where sweating occurs, so we can perform evaporative cooling. Contraction of the erector pili muscles, it's believed that at least at one time when these muscles contract, it helps the hair kind of capture warm air. It's not really important anymore. Of course, protection. Keratin is a really, really good protein for kind of waterproofing our skin, resisting abrasions, as well as the invasion of pathogens. Lipids, that's found in the oils, help our skin from becoming dehydrated. And of course, melanin protects us against UV light. It's also a blood reservoir. The skin holds a lot of blood, about 10% of total blood volume. So if you are in a fight or flight response, that's why you become pale, because your body is shunting all of that blood from the skin to the vital organs. Excretion and absorption, so we absorb some things from the skin. We excrete some waste products like urea. Vitamin D3 synthesis, so this is where vitamin D precursors begin activation. Vitamin D is completely activated in the kidneys, but it begins in the skin in response to UV light. And then sensations, of course. So tactile sensations like touch and pressure and vibratory sensations, as well as thermal sensations, so like warmth or the lack of warmth, and of course pain. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.